It's time to revise. How are you doing, everybody? I hope your studies are going smoothly. Welcome back. Today we're going to be looking at the psychodynamic approach to psychology with special mention of Sigmund Freud. Let's do it. There they are, look. Those are some tasty looking exam style questions. You've got timings, you've got everything you need. So here's your chance to pause the video, give it a go, and come back when you're ready to hear me talk through. Okay, let's go. Right, we want to state an assumption. We don't particularly need to explain it, but we don't want short generic waffle. So I'd probably go for something along the lines of, one assumption is that behaviour is driven by unconscious conflicts. That'll do for 1 mark. I suppose you could say something like, one assumption is that the personality develops in a series of psychosexual stages. But I'd go for the unconscious one, personally. Explain the term defence mechanism. Okay, so a defence mechanism is an unconscious strategy that is used to protect the ego. It typically involves distorting reality, such as denial. Yeah, you could elaborate with the example of repression or something if you want, though. But I think what I've said is enough for 2 marks. Right, so now we want to outline 2 stages of psychosexual development. Remember that the stages are the oral, anal, phallic, latent, and genital stages. And to outline them, I mean, we've got 2 stages, 4 marks, so 2 plus 2. But I'd be thinking about what's happening at that stage, and if possible, roughly when is it? If you can remember it, ages, fantastic, or at least kind of where they come in the order. Right, so the one you're probably most familiar with is, I reckon, the phallic stage, because that's where you get the Oedipus complex. I'm sure you've heard of the Oedipus complex, and maybe the little Hans study. Yeah, the phobia of horses, a little boy. Not that I particularly need to outline that here, but that's what's going on in the phallic stage. So what would I say? I'd probably say one stage of psychosexual development is the phallic stage, which occurs from around 3 to 6 years. In this stage, children boys resolve the Oedipus complex, which leads to the inheritance of the superego. Yeah, that's one of the key things about the phallic stage. You've got the Oedipus complex, and that's when the superego develops. Okay, there isn't so much to know about some of the other ones. Let's go for oral. Okay, so the first stage of development is the oral phase, which runs from birth to around 2 years. At this stage, the fixation of the libido is around the mouth. Yeah, and getting stuck or getting fixated at this stage can lead to later behaviours such as chewing nails or smoking. There you go, done. So a bit about the stage, what's going on, maybe even what it leads to or when it is. Right, this time we want to explain the structure of the personality according to the psychodynamic approach. Now, if you see personality, you're probably thinking about id, ego, and superego. That's the route I'd go down, but you could talk about the distinction between the conscious and the unconscious, if you like. Yeah, you're probably aware of that iceberg metaphor. I'm going to go down the route of talking about Freud's 3 parts, the tripartite personality. So, the structure of the personality. Freud argued that the personality is divided into 3 sections, or 3 parts. The id operates according to the pleasure principle and is responsible for kind of instinctual drives and our need for food and sex and those kind of things. Opposed to the id is the superego. The superego operates according to the morality principle and acts as our conscience, forcing us to consider what society would expect of us and forcing us to experience guilt. In between the id and the superego is the ego. The ego's role is to balance the needs of the id and the superego, to mediate that conflict and ultimately operate according to the reality principle. Yeah? So it's going to listen to the id, it's going to listen to the superego, and it's going to go, okay, well, in reality, this is what we're going to do now, guys. All right. And now we've got an application question. So we've got Tom, who's not done any coursework, deadline's coming up, he gets told off, pushes over a plant, goes home, plays computer games, says, don't worry about it, Mum, I've got ages to do this coursework. Okay, now, I guess this could just say, outline the psychodynamic approach, refer to Tom, but I've gone for explain the role of defence mechanisms in Tom's behaviour to be a bit more specific. So I think what should jump out here very clearly is that there are two defense mechanisms going on here. We've got displacement and we've got denial. So what I'm going to do is break this down to 3 marks plus 3 marks. I'm going to explain what those defense mechanisms are. I might even start by just explaining what defense mechanisms are generally and then linking it to Tom. So something along the lines of defense mechanisms are unconscious strategies, blah, blah, blah. We talked about that earlier. One example of a defense mechanism is denial. This is where we distort reality. We refuse to accept what's going on. And this is seen in the scenario because Tom tells his mum he's got ages to finish the coursework. He's denying that the deadline is only 5 days away. Yeah, that's kind of where I'd go with the link. Another defense mechanism is displacement. This is where we redirect our energy or our aggression against a different target because we're unable to take it out against the true target. So in the scenario, we see this because Tom is angry with either himself or with the principal of the college because he's been told off. And he can't take out that anger against the principal, so he takes it out against the plant when he leaves. Yeah, so he's displacing, he's redirecting that frustration. Okay, and that's helped him to avoid putting that blame on himself and avoid the kind of the fallout from that. Yeah, so he's an ego defense mechanism, remember, protecting himself. All right, we want to explain one limitation of the psychodynamic approach to psychology. So I'm going to go for let's go lack of scientific method. That's a good one, I think. Okay, so one limitation of the psychodynamic approach to psychology is its rejection of the scientific method. The psychodynamic approach focuses on unobservable, unconscious drives and behaviors. This is at odds with the core scientific principle of falsification. If we cannot test and observe these behaviors, then we cannot form hypotheses and try to prove them wrong. Yeah, so the psychodynamic approach lacks falsification. Now, this is 4 marks. You'd probably typically see this as a 3-mark question, but I've gone for 4. So let's elaborate this limitation more, and let's maybe give another example of how it's not scientific. Yeah? Okay. So, furthermore, the psychodynamic approach relies on subjective interpretations. For example, Freud used case studies and dream analysis and diary analysis in his work, which is highly subjective. This is, again, at odds with a core feature of science, which is objectivity. Yeah, now I'm going to bring it together at the end. So therefore, this demonstrates the lack of scientific credibility in the psychodynamic approach, something like that. Okay? Okay, so this time I want to evaluate the role of the id, the ego, and the superego for 6 marks. So the command word here, of course, is just evaluate, so we're not going to explain what those things are particularly. And for 6 marks of evaluation, I'd probably be looking at 2 points, 2 paragraphs, 2 peels. Now, I know it sounds quite specific, because it says id, ego, and superego, rather than the psychodynamic approach, but I would still advise that you try to bring that evaluation of the approach more generally to this question, and just try and shape it to the id, ego, and superego. So we've just had a discussion about, the lack of scientific credibility and how it's not observable, it's not testable. That's fine, that applies to this as well. Yeah? So you're going to say something like, the conflict between the id and the superego is in the unconscious and is therefore untestable and unobservable. So just shape it that way. So I think that's fine for 1 point. You could talk about another point in terms of maybe one limitation is the focus on determinism. Yeah, so saying that behavior is determined by the conflict between the id and the superego is maybe a limited way of looking at behavior because it rejects the role of free will. You could, if you didn't fancy that one, you wanted another point, you could talk about maybe applications. You could talk about how the behaviors like aggression and offending, those kind of things, can be explained in terms of the behavior of the actions of the id and the superego. Because you could say that aggression or offending might be the result of an overpowered id or a strong id and a weak superego. So you could talk about those. And if you're at the end of year 13, if you've done things like forensic psychology, you could bring some of that knowledge in there, because you could talk about the 3 types of superego, such as the deviant superego or the over harsh superego, if you wanted to. Yeah, I wouldn't go too much in that direction because it's not paper 3. But what you are doing is you're showing that the id and the superego are important for understanding behaviours. Okay, describe and evaluate the psychodynamic approach. Okay, probably a 4+4. So to describe it, you've just got to go through your key features or your key assumptions. You're going to talk about the role of the unconscious. You're going to talk about the id, ego, and superego. You could talk about defense mechanisms. You could talk about the psychosexual stages. You're not going to do all of that. I'd pick maybe a couple of those and explain them in some depth. There is a bit of a depth versus breadth trade-off, but you can't just kind of do a list of all of the concepts. Yeah, you need some depth, some explanation backing that up. So just pick a couple for this 8 marker. In terms of evaluation, we've already talked about the fact that it's not scientific. We've talked about the fact that it rejects free will and therefore kind of favours determinism. We've talked about applications of the approach to things like offending. Other things you could bring in, and I guess I'm kind of rolling this into the next, into the 16 marker as well, so I'm not going to repeat all of this in a minute, but you could also talk about the fact that, Freud was very gender biased in how he did his work. You could talk about how it, is maybe socially sensitive because of this focus on femininity being failed masculinity that Freud seemed to have in his mind, is devaluing the role of women in society. Yeah, but broadly, as I said, you're going to pick maybe 2, possibly 3 features of the approach and explain them, and you're going to have probably 2 evaluation or discussion paragraphs backing that up to get those 8 marks. When we come to look at doing this as a 16 marker, then breaking it down, because there is a scenario, we're going to refer back to the Tom one in this question, but I guess it could just be a straight 16 marker, in which case kind of do all of what I just said for the 8 marker. But in this one, this would be broken down into a 6, 4 and 6, so 6 knowledge, 4 application, and 6 evaluation. So I'm not going to go through all the knowledge again, because we've done that. We'll talk about the application, and then remember for 6 evaluation marks, you probably want 2 developed points. So I'm just going to go through the application for this one, okay, because we have talked about the rest of it. So in terms of applying this to Tom, we talked earlier about defense mechanisms, so if you've skipped ahead, go back. I'm not going to go through all of that again, but broadly you're going to talk about displacement, when he pushed over the plant, and you're going to talk about denial, because he's telling his mum he doesn't need to do his coursework right now. So other points of application. So you could also bring in the role of the id. You could say that perhaps Tom has a strong id, or that the superego isn't able to overpower the id. Yeah, the ego isn't mediating that conflict effectively because Tom is showing this aggression, yeah, towards that plant. So that's the id maybe taking over. Okay. I probably wouldn't put too much of a focus on the psychosexual stages in this one. It's worth mentioning for knowledge, for sure, but in terms of the application, not particularly convinced there's much to hang my hat on there, so I probably wouldn't make a big fuss about that. Okay, so maybe just a mention in the knowledge, and then in terms of the application, you're talking about defense mechanisms, you're talking about the role of the id, and maybe the ego not managing that conflict effectively. Okay, right, that's that one. Time to reflect. How did that go for you? Why did it go that way? And what are you going to do next? Right, we've reached the end. That was me discussing the psychodynamic approach to psychology and talking through some exam questions. I hope that was useful for you. Good luck with it all. Keep bashing away at it. I'll see you again in another video. Take care. Bish bash bosh.